She was sent to the ranch as a spectacle, but the silent cowboy placed his coat on her shoulders, and the wagon reached the ranch at the hour when the sun bleeds its last light into the dust. The air smelled of hay and iron, of horses sweating in the dusk. Inside, Hannah sat with her hands bound loosely in her lap, wrists sore from the rope, her dress clinging to her skin after days of rough travel. She could feel the eyes on her even before she looked up, ranch hands gathering like vultures, waiting to see the woman sent here for shame, the woman everyone whispered about. When the driver pulled the reins, she stepped down, her boots touching dry soil that cracked like old skin. The men laughed, their words slick with the same dust. A town girl come to work among men. They expected her to shrink, to tremble. And she might have, if not for the man who stepped from the shadows of the barn. He was tall, coat slung over one arm, hat pulled low against the dying light. His silence stilled the noise around him like a wind dying in the canyon. The others turned away first. He didn't look at them, only at her, steady, unreadable, not with pity, but with something quieter, something human. Then, without a word, he placed his coat across her shoulders. It smelled faintly of pine and smoke. The laughter stopped. She wanted to thank him, but couldn't find her voice. Someone muttered, "Henry don't talk much, don't expect him to," and led her toward the low ranch house that leaned into the wind. She glanced back once. Henry had already turned away, walking toward the corral, the coat she wore leaving her strangely weightless. Inside, the house felt too quiet for its eyes. The walls breathed with the slow rhythm of solitude. There were no decorations, no woman's touch, only tools lined neatly by the door, a table worn smooth by elbows, a single lamp burning low. The foreman, an older man with a beard the color of frost, said she could have the small room at the back, if she earned it. She nodded. The first night, she didn't sleep. The silence pressed in, broken only by the wind's whistle through the boards. She thought of the town she'd left behind, the false accusations, the women's eyes heavy with judgment, the way her name had turned sour in people's mouths. She had no family, no coin, nowhere else to go. Her hands were cracked from labor, and yet empty. By morning, she found a note on the table. Start in the kitchen. Feed the child by dawn. H. The handwriting was sharp, deliberate, as if each letter had been carved rather than written. She found the kitchen already half-lit, a small fire in the stove. A little girl sat on a stool, swinging her legs, hair the same dark gold as Henry's. She looked up, wary but curious. In her hands, a doll missing an arm. "You must be Miss Hannah," the child said softly. "Papa said you'd come help." Hannah nodded, unsure if she should smile. "And you must be Ellie." The girl brightened. "Do you know stories? About angels? Mama used to tell them." Hannah's breath caught. She shook her head. "Maybe I'll learn." Ellie accepted that answer easily, as children do. She talked while Hannah cooked, her small voice a fragile thing in the wide, empty house. Henry came in near noon, silent as before, hat in hand. He nodded once at Hannah, once at the girl, and ate without sound. For days it went that way, work, quiet, the sound of hooves at dawn. Henry spoke only when necessary, his tone even, almost careful. Yet beneath it, Hannah sensed gentleness in the way he set down his tools, in how he never raised his voice at the hands. When he passed by her in the hallway, he tipped his hat slightly, a gesture that felt heavier than words. Ellie began following Hannah everywhere. She'd sit beside her while she mended, asking about the world beyond the ranch. Sometimes she'd hold Hannah's hand without asking, the small palm warm against her rough fingers. One afternoon, while sweeping the porch, Hannah asked the foreman quietly what had happened to Ellie's mother. He hesitated before answering. "Gone 3 winters now. Fever took her quick. Henry ain't been the same since." That night, Hannah watched Henry from the kitchen window. He was standing by the barn, motionless, the wind pulling at his coat. She realized then that his silence wasn't cold, it was grief, weathered down until it looked like calm. The days became a pattern, like stitching a new life from torn cloth. Hannah cooked, taught Ellie letters, helped mend the fence when needed. Henry began leaving small kindnesses behind. Her tools sharpened, her room repaired where the rain had leaked in. Once, when her hands blistered from chopping wood, she found a jar of salve left by her door. No note, but she knew whose hand had placed it there. Winter crept in slowly, painting frost on the window panes. The air turned sharp enough to bite. Henry spent most evenings by the fire, silent while Ellie played with her doll. Sometimes, when Hannah passed, he'd lift his eyes from the flames, meeting hers for a heartbeat before looking away. It was enough to unsettle her in ways she didn't understand. One evening, a windstorm rolled over the plains. The house groaned under it. Ellie woke, crying, frightened by the noise. Hannah went to her room, sitting beside the small bed until the child's breathing steadied. "Do you miss your mama?" she asked gently. Ellie nodded. "But when you're here, I don't miss her so much." The words struck deep, leaving Hannah still. She stroked the girl's hair until her hand trembled. After a long pause, Ellie whispered, "Will you stay with me forever and be my mom?" The world seemed to hush. Hannah felt her throat tighten. She wanted to say yes, wanted to promise the child something solid. But truth and fear tangled together. "I'll stay as long as I can," she whispered. "And I'll care for you, I promise that." When Ellie finally slept, Hannah remained there, listening to the wind die down. She could still hear the girl's question echoing inside her. It followed her into dreams. By morning, she made a decision. She found Henry outside, fixing the fence, frost smoking from his breath. "I'd like to make things clear," she said, her hands folded to still their shaking. "I'll stay and help with the house, with Ellie. But I can't be anything more. Not your wife. Not the talk of the town again. I need peace, not promises." He looked at her for a long moment, snowflakes gathering in his hair. Then he nodded once. "That's fair. I mean to make it official," she said. "A contract. So there's no misunderstanding." Henry pulled a folded paper from his pocket, a habit, she would learn later, of a man who prepared for everything. He handed it to her. "Write what you need to feel safe." She wrote with stiff fingers, her words simple, that she would remain as helper, that he would provide food, shelter, and fair treatment. She signed her name, then watched him sign his. Henry Cale. His handwriting was as steady as his manner. When it was done, they stood in silence. The wind had quieted. Only the horses breathed behind the fence. "Thank you," she said softly. He gave a single nod, his eyes unreadable but kind. "You've done right by the girl," he said, almost under his breath. "And by me." That night, Hannah placed the signed paper in her drawer and sat by the window, watching the lanterns of the ranch flicker across the plain. The house no longer felt strange. It felt waiting, like a heart learning to beat again. In the weeks that followed, something in her began to ease. She laughed more, sometimes without meaning to. She caught Henry watching once or twice, not in the way men had looked at her before, but with quiet understanding, as if he saw not her shame, but her strength. When spring came, the hills turned green again, and Ellie picked wildflowers to place in jars along the windowsill. Henry said little, but Hannah noticed he left the flowers untouched, even when they dried and turned brittle. On the first warm evening, she took laundry to the line, the sky wide and violet above her. Henry was by the barn, tending the horses. Ellie ran between them, chasing a butterfly, her laughter cutting through the twilight. Hannah pinned the last sheet and turned. Henry stood watching her, one hand resting on the fence post. Their eyes met across the yard, and she felt the same quiet warmth she'd known that first day when he placed his coat on her shoulders. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. The air itself carried the words they hadn't yet found. Inside, the lamp glowed through the window, soft as promise. The contract lay folded in her drawer, untouched, but somehow lighter now, as if it no longer bound her, but simply held the space where something truer might grow. The night deepened, stars gathering like scattered embers. Henry led the horses in, Hannah closed the door, Ellie's laughter faded into dreams, and for the first time, the ranch no longer felt like exile. It felt like beginning. The days folded into months, quiet and steady as breath. The ranch changed with the season, grass returning, fences mended, the scent of thawed earth rising after every rain. Hannah no longer flinched at the sound of men's laughter, no longer felt the sting of old words. She had found rhythm in the work, peace in the silence, and something unnamed in the presence of the man who owned the land she now called home. Henry spoke little still, yet his silence no longer felt distant. It was a shelter. His voice, when it came, carried weight, each word deliberate as a hand placed gently on a wound. She had learned to read his quiet ways, the small pause before he spoke to Ellie, the way his eyes softened when Hannah hummed while cooking, the manner in which he looked toward the porch light before entering the house, as though grateful someone waited for him inside. Ellie grew like a wildflower, sun-fed and unafraid. She followed her father through the fields, then ran to Hannah's side to repeat everything she'd seen, her sentences tumbling over one another like creek water over stone. Henry listened from afar, his gaze full of something tender and half-broken. Hannah sometimes caught it and had to look away before her chest betrayed her. The gossip from town reached them faintly, carried by passing traders. The girl who'd been a scandal now running a household, the silent cowboy letting her. Hannah pretended not to care, but sometimes the whispers returned at night, echoing in her head. The difference now was that they no longer rooted deep. This place, this small life, had given her weight against the wind. Late one afternoon, a storm gathered in the west. The horizon darkened, clouds swelling heavy with rain. The air went strange and still. Henry called the ranch hands in, his voice rough but calm. The wind shifted, sudden and fierce, scattering loose hay and dust. Hannah hurried to pull down laundry from the line as the first drops began to fall. Lightning cracked across the hills. The horses screamed from the corral. Henry was already running toward them, coat flapping, his shout swallowed by thunder. Hannah saw one of the gates swing open, a frightened stallion kicking against the wind. Before she thought, she was running too. Mud clung to her boots, rain soaking through her dress, hair plastered to her face. She reached the fence, gripping the post as the storm roared around her. Henry was trying to close the gate, his strength fighting the wind's pull. When he turned, she was beside him, pushing with all she had. The gate slammed shut, but her foot slipped, the ground slick beneath her. He caught her before she fell, arms wrapping around her with startling force. For a heartbeat, the world stilled. The storm, the fear, the years between them. His chest rose against hers, his breath uneven, his hand trembling where it held her shoulder. Rain streaked down his face like tears he'd never let fall. "Are you hurt?" His voice was hoarse, near lost in the wind. She shook her head, unable to speak. They stood like that, breath mingling, until the thunder rolled away into the distance. The rain softened, then slowed. When they finally stepped apart, neither moved far. Henry's gaze lingered on her face, as though seeing something he'd been afraid to name. Inside the barn, the air smelled of wet straw and wood smoke. He lit a lantern, the light trembling across the boards. Hannah brushed mud from her skirt, her fingers shaking. The silence between them felt different now, no longer the quiet of strangers, but of two people standing on the edge of something real. She tried to steady her breath. "You could have been hurt. So could you. I had to help." He nodded once, then looked at her, really looked. "You always do." Her chest tightened. "Because this place is my duty." His brow furrowed. "Is that all it is?" She hesitated. "It's what we agreed." Henry took a step closer, lantern light flickering over the worn lines of his face. "That paper was just words, Hannah. I've never seen you as a helper." "Then what am I?" He seemed to wrestle with the answer, as if afraid of its shape. "The reason this house feels alive again." Something in her broke at that, quietly and completely. All the restraint, the rules she'd written for herself, the lines she'd drawn, they blurred in the space between them. She reached for the nearest wall to steady herself, but found his hand instead. He didn't let go. "I don't know when it happened," he said, voice low. "But you're in every thought I have." Her breath trembled. "Henry, don't. I've held it back long enough." His thumb brushed against her wrist, gentle as breath. "Tell me to stop, and I will." She didn't. The lantern hissed softly, and outside the rain whispered against the roof. Their silence deepened until it was full of every word neither had spoken. When she finally met his gaze, there was no storm left between them, only calm, fierce and tender. He touched her face as if asking permission, and she leaned into the touch before her mind could protest. The kiss, when it came, was quiet but certain, carrying the weight of everything they had endured alone. When they pulled apart, she found herself smiling through tears. "What do we do now?" "Whatever makes you stay," he said simply. That night, the storm moved east, leaving the land washed clean. Hannah lay awake long after the house fell silent, the sound of rain still soft in her mind. The contract sat folded in her drawer, meaningless now. She rose, lit the lamp, and unfolded the paper. The ink had faded slightly where her fingers had touched it too often. She tore it in two, then in four, and dropped the pieces into the flame. They curled into ash, without smoke. When Henry came down in the morning, he found her by the hearth, the lamp still burning low. She met his eyes without hesitation. "I tore it," she said. He looked at the ashes, then at her. "You sure? I don't need paper to tell me where I belong." For a moment, neither spoke. Then he stepped forward, taking her hands in his. "Stay," he said softly. "Not because you owe me, because you want to." "I do." He let out a breath that sounded like years lifting off his chest. The following days were gentle, filled with the simple rhythm of life. Ellie seemed to sense the change before anyone spoke it aloud. She clung to Hannah's skirts, asking when they would be a real family. Hannah smiled each time, but said nothing, letting the truth unfold naturally. When spring's first wildflowers appeared along the creek, Henry led them both down to the cottonwoods that grew at the edge of the property. There, beneath branches just beginning to bud, he held out a small ring. The silver was worn thin from age, the kind of piece that had been passed through generations. "It was my mother's," he said. "She'd wanted to have a home again." Hannah looked at the ring, then at him. "You're certain?" "I've been certain a long time." Her hands trembled as he slipped it onto her finger. It fit as though it had been waiting. Ellie cheered, throwing petals she'd gathered earlier, her laughter ringing clear through the trees. The ceremony was only the three of them. No preacher, no witnesses but the wind and the wide, forgiving sky. Yet it felt sacred, truer than anything written on paper. Afterward, they walked back to the house together. Henry carried Ellie on his shoulders, her small hands tangled in his hair. Hannah walked beside them, her fingers brushing his with quiet promise. That evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, the house glowed from within. The table was set for three, the sound of laughter spilling into the yard. For the first time, the ranch no longer felt haunted. It felt like home. Later, when Ellie had gone to bed and the lanterns burned low, Hannah stepped onto the porch. The sky was clear, stars spread like spilled salt. Henry joined her, leaning against the rail. "I never thought I'd see this place happy again," he said. "You gave the chance," she replied. He looked at her, the faintest smile touching his lips. "No, you did." They stood in silence, the night wind warm and full of crickets. Somewhere far off, a coyote called, its cry rising and falling like a hymn. Hannah rested her head against his shoulder, and for the first time, the quiet between them felt complete. In the years to come, people would forget the scandal, the rumors, the story that began with a girl sent away in disgrace. But the land remembered differently. It remembered a woman who arrived shivering under a stranger's coat and stayed long enough to make that silence bloom into life. And sometimes, when the wind moved through the cottonwoods just right, it sounded like laughter, a reminder that love, the truest kind, doesn't come with noise or promise. It comes softly, like dawn across the plains, and stays for good. Stay close, friend. Subscribe so you don't miss the next tale beneath the wide western sky.